Some agreements are written in ink. Some are written in desperation. And some, the ones that change everything, are written in the quiet space between two people who have both decided very firmly that they will not feel a thing. This is the story of one of those agreements. It begins in Laramie, Wyoming Territory in the autumn of 1878, with a woman who had learned to read the law the way other women read their husbands, carefully, looking for the loopholes, prepared for disappointment. Her name was Nora Voss. She was 24 years old. She had 30 days left to save the only thing she had left to save. And she had exactly one name on her list. She didn't know yet what that name would cost her. She didn't know yet that some prices are worth paying. Stay with me. This one is going to take a while, and it is going to be worth every minute. The office of Judge Harlan Aldridge smelled like old wood older paper and the particular brand of defeat that settles into rooms where people come to hear bad news. Nora had been in this room 4 times in the past 8 months. She knew exactly which floorboard creaked near the door. She knew the judge kept peppermint candies in his left desk drawer and only offered them when he was about to say something he felt bad about. He was reaching for the drawer when she walked in. She sat down before he could gesture to the chair. She set her folder on the desk. 3 years of documents, survey maps, receipts, the original land claim, filed in Daniel's name. Her name written in the margin in her own handwriting, because that was as close to legal as a wife could get in 1875. "Mrs. Voss," the judge said, "tell me what the appeal said." He folded his hands. Aldridge was a decent man as judges went. He had the kind of face that had spent too many years delivering verdicts it disagreed with. The territorial court upheld the original ruling. Without a male heir or a male co-claimant on record, the Voss homestead reverts to the next of kin on the original deed, which is Daniel's father. Daniel's father never set foot on that land. That is not relevant to the statute. I broke that land. I planted it. I built the second fence line myself because Daniel's back went out that winter and we couldn't afford to hire anyone. I buried my husband in that ground. Her voice was level. She had practiced this. And the law says it belongs to a man who has never even seen it. The law says what it says, Mrs. Voss. I'm sorry. She looked at the peppermint candy sitting on the edge of the desk. She did not take it. You said you had a name, she said. The judge was quiet for a moment. Then he leaned back in his chair, the wood creaking under the shift. This is outside my official capacity, he said. I understand. And I want to be clear that I'm not suggesting anything improper. Judge Aldridge. The name. He reached into the right drawer this time and pulled out a folded piece of paper. He slid it across the desk without quite looking at her. Callum Reed. He runs the Double Spur Ranch up north about 40 miles past the Laramie foothills. Good land, good operation. He came to see me 3 weeks ago about a separate legal matter involving his ranch and a land deed that requires a married man's signature under the new territorial inheritance statute. Nora looked at the name on the paper. The handwriting was the judge's neat and deliberate. He needs a wife. He needs a legal wife on record before the county assessor's review in 30 days. His brother has filed a competing claim on the Double Spur based on an old clause in their father's will, a clause that becomes void if Callum is legally married. And what does he offer in exchange? 40 acres on the east boundary of his property, clear deed in your name alone, transferable upon the completion of a 1-year legal marriage. Housing and provisions for the duration. The judge paused. It's not a love match, Mrs. Voss. No, she said. It's a contract. Those I understand. She folded the paper and put it in her coat pocket. She was almost to the door when the judge spoke again. He's not an easy man. Nora paused with her hand on the doorframe. The wood was smooth there, worn by years of hands in the same position, people pausing at the threshold of whatever came next. "Neither am I," she said, and she walked out into the gray Wyoming morning. She had 1 hour before the meeting the judge had already arranged, because Aldridge had known before she walked in that she would say yes. She used that hour to walk. Laramie in October smelled like coal smoke, and coming winter the kind of coal that hadn't arrived yet but was making its intentions known. The mountains sat on the western horizon like a promise or a threat, depending on the day. Nora had been here for 6 weeks, living in a $2-a-week room above the hardware store, while she fought a legal battle she was losing by inches. She thought about Daniel, not the way she used to, the first year after, when grief was a physical thing that lived in her chest like a stone. Now she thought about him the way you think about a place you used to live, with something like tenderness and something like the recognition that you can't go back there, and that going back wouldn't fix anything anyway. Daniel Voss had been a good man. Quiet, steady, the kind of man who showed love through what he built rather than what he said. He had died in the 3rd winter, a fever that went wrong too fast, and Nora had sat with him through 4 days of it, watching him become someone smaller than himself until he was just her husband's face on a pillow, still and finally at rest. She had not cried at the funeral. She had been too busy calculating what she had left and what she needed to do next. People had thought her cold. She had thought them impractical. The land was what Daniel had wanted. The land was what she had worked for. The land was the only thing she had left of the life they had tried to build, and she was not going to let Herschel Voss, a man who had never once visited his son's homestead, take it because the law had been written by men who thought women were decorative. So she walked into the judge's building. She climbed the stairs to the 2nd-floor meeting room. She opened the door, and she met Callum Reed for the first time. He was standing at the window with his back to her, looking out at the street below. Tall, broader through the shoulders than she'd expected from a rancher who worked his own land, though she supposed that was exactly the build that kind of work produced. Dark coat worn at the elbows. Hat in his hand, which meant he'd just taken it off, which meant he'd heard her on the stairs. He turned when she closed the door. His face was what the land does to a man when he's lived in it long enough. Weathered into something you couldn't quite call handsome, but couldn't call plain either. Strong jawlines at the corners of his eyes from squinting into sun and wind. Brown eyes darker than she expected. A mouth that looked like it had forgotten what smiling felt like. He looked at her the way she'd heard men looked at land they were considering buying. Assessing. Not unkind, but not warm either. She looked back the same way. "Mrs. Voss," he said. His voice was lower than she expected. Measured, like he chose each word the way you choose each step on uncertain ground. "Mr. Reed, you know what this is?" "A business arrangement." "Yes." He nodded once slowly. Then he walked to the table where a stack of papers was already laid out, and he pulled out a chair. Not for her. He sat down in it himself, turned the papers to face the empty chair across from him, and waited. She sat down. They read the contract together, 37 clauses. She read every one. She asked questions about Clause 11, which was vague about property maintenance responsibilities, and Clause 22, which had an ambiguous phrase about mutual cooperation in ranch operations that could mean anything. He answered each question without impatience, which told her something. She made 3 amendments. He accepted 2 of them and countered on the 3rd. She accepted his counter. She noticed when he leaned forward to initial the amendment on Clause 19 that his handwriting was careful, almost precise. The letters deliberate like each one mattered. It didn't match the rest of him, this rancher with the worn coat and the face like weathered granite. She filed that away without knowing why. "Wagon leaves at first light," he said, when they had both signed the last page. "I'll be ready." He stood, put his hat back on, nodded once more, that same economy of motion. He was almost to the door when she spoke. "Mr. Reed, one question." He stopped but didn't turn fully. Half his face in shadow. Is there anything about this arrangement that you haven't told me? A pause. Not long, not quite long enough to mean yes, not quite short enough to mean no. No, he said. And then he was gone. Nora sat at the table alone for a moment, her signed name at the bottom of 37 clauses. Around her, the room was quiet, except for the faint sound of the street below. Horses and voices and the ordinary machinery of a town going about its day. She told herself this was a business arrangement. She was good at business. She was good at not feeling things. She'd had years of practice. She picked up her copy of the contract and walked back to her rented room to pack. She had almost nothing. That was the practical truth of the situation. Everything she owned fit into 2 bags, a canvas, one her grandmother had made, and a leather one she'd bought at auction the year Daniel died for 60 cents. 2 winter dresses. A summer one she might not need until spring. A spare pair of boots that fit well enough. A brush nearly new. The previous one having finally surrendered after years of Wyoming winters. A medical book she'd bought because there was no doctor within 20 miles of the homestead and someone had to know things. And a small Bible not because she was particularly devout, but because it had her mother's handwriting in the margins and that felt like something worth keeping. She did not pack sentiment. She was not sure she had any left. She was wrong about that, but she wouldn't know it for a while yet. The wagon left at first light as promised. Callum drove. She sat beside him on the bench. The sky was just beginning to turn over the mountains, violet bleeding into pale gold, the kind of sky that looked like an apology for the cold. Their breath made small clouds in the air between them. The horses moved at a steady walk out of town, their hooves on the packed road a sound like a slow clock. He didn't speak. She didn't speak. This went on for a long time. She watched the land change as they moved north. Laramie's flat grid of streets gave way to open country, the kind of country that reminded you very quickly that humans were a recent addition to the landscape and not necessarily the most important one. Grass dry now in October gold and copper and brown. The mountains pacing them to the west. The sky enormous above everything. The kind of sky that could make a person feel either very free or very small, depending on what they'd left behind. An hour out of town, they crossed a creek. Callum slowed the wagon, let the horses drink. She watched him, the way he held the reins loose but ready, the way he watched the horses not with impatience, but with the attention of someone who understood that animals communicated if you paid attention. He waited until they were done, gave them another minute. Then clicked his tongue softly, and they moved on. That was all. But she filed it away. 2 hours out, he stopped the wagon entirely. She looked at him. He was looking at her. "Your back is bothering you," he said, not a question. She opened her mouth to say it wasn't, which was a lie. She'd been preparing since the second hour when the wagon bench had proven to be exactly as unforgiving as it looked. "I'm fine. There's a rest about a quarter mile ahead. Old way station, nobody uses it anymore. 5 minutes. He didn't wait for her agreement. He drove the quarter mile, pulled off the road, and stopped the wagon beside a stand of cottonwoods that still held some of their leaves, yellow and trembling. He got down and walked to the other side to check one of the rear wheels without looking at her. She got down, stretched, walked a few paces. The relief was immediate and humiliating. When she climbed back up, he was already back on the bench, reins in hand, looking ahead. "Thank you," she said. "Long drive," he said, as if that explained it. They drove on. She looked at the side of his face and wondered what kind of man noticed that a stranger's back was hurting and stopped the wagon without making it into a thing. She decided not to decide what kind of man that was. Not yet. They arrived at the Double Spur Ranch as the sun was beginning to tip toward the horizon, the sky going orange and rose and the particular shade of deep blue that meant winter was waiting just one ridge over. She saw the ranch from the top of the last hill before the road dipped down. It was bigger than she expected. The main house was solid, 2 stories weatherboard siding gone gray-silver with age and weather, a covered porch running along the front. Behind it, 2 large barns, a bunkhouse, a structure she couldn't identify from this distance. Fences stretching out in every direction, the land rolling away from the buildings in long grass that moved in the evening wind. It was not beautiful the way the frontier brochures back east made things look beautiful. It was something more than that. It looked like something someone had cared about for a long time. She noticed that Callum was watching her as she took it in. She said nothing. He said nothing. The wagon rolled down the hill toward the house. A man came out of the nearest barn as they pulled in. Old 70, or close to it, with a face that looked like it had been carved from the same material as the mountains, and a way of walking that said his knees had opinions about stairs. He took the horses' heads with practiced ease and looked up at Nora with eyes that were still sharp. "So you're the wife," he said. "I'm the new arrival," she said. He grinned. Most of his front teeth were still present. "Good answer. I'm Jonesy. I run the horses and the bunkhouse, and generally whatever Callum forgot to assign to somebody. Welcome to the Double Spur." "Thank you, Jonesy." Callum had already gone ahead to the house. She followed, carrying her own bags because she had not asked for help and he had not offered it. And that arrangement suited them both. The inside of the house was plain and clean. A front room with a stone fireplace, a long table. Chairs, shelves along one wall with books and ledgers, and a collection of objects that accumulated in working houses, a kitchen through the back, a staircase going up. The room he showed her to was at the end of the upstairs hall. A bed with a wool blanket, a washstand, a window looking east toward where she knew her 40 acres would eventually be. The room had been cleaned recently. She could smell the soap. Someone had put a small bunch of dried wildflowers on the windowsill. She didn't comment on it. Neither did he. "Supper's at 7, he said. "I'll show you the rest of the property tomorrow." He went back downstairs. She sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the dried flowers for a long moment. Then she unpacked her bags, hung her dresses on the pegs behind the door, set her medical book on the shelf beside the bed, put her grandmother's Bible on the windowsill next to the flowers. She was going to be here for a year. She was going to be professional about it. She was going to be fine. Supper was venison stew and cornbread, simple and good. Jonesy ate with them, which she was grateful for, because Jonesy talked and his talking filled the space that would otherwise have been occupied by the particular variety of silence that accumulates between 2 strangers who are pretending to be married. "Ranch runs about 400 head right now," Jonesy told her as if she'd asked. "Good stock. We had a strong calf crop this spring. Callum's been fighting Harlan Drew's boys about the south fence line since August, which is a headache and a half, but that's nothing new." He tore off a piece of cornbread. "Drew's been buying up land east and west of us for 2 years now, trying to lock up the creek access." She looked at Callum. "The creek that runs through your south pasture." "My south pasture and 6 other ranches," he said. "Drew got 3 of them to sign water rights agreements last year. Agreements that look fair until you read them carefully." "Have you read them carefully?" He looked at her. "I've read them. I don't have the legal background to know what I'm missing." She thought about the folder she'd brought in her bag. 3 years of learning to read land documents. Learning to find the clauses that looked innocuous and weren't. "I'd like to see them," she said. "The agreements Drew had the others sign." Another pause. "Why?" "Because if there's a pattern to how he constructs these agreements, there's likely a way to challenge them, or at least to build a defense before he brings the same document to you," said. Jonesy put down his cornbread and looked at Callum with an expression that said, "See, this is why I said this was a good idea, but aloud he said nothing. Callum looked at her for a long moment. "I'll find them after supper," he said. "Good." She went back to her stew. Under the table out of sight, she pressed her hand flat against her knee to stop it from shaking. Not from fear, from something she hadn't felt in a long time. The particular energy of being useful in a way that mattered, of being seen as someone who could solve something rather than someone who needed to be managed. She was going to be very careful about that feeling. It was the kind of feeling that complicated things. After supper, she told Callum what she'd found in the water agreements. They sat at the kitchen table, the lamp between them, the document spread out. She walked him through it, clause by clause, the way the language appeared reasonable on the surface, and then 3 pages in, contained a subordinate clause that redefined shared creek access in a way that gave Drew's operation priority rights during drought conditions, which in Wyoming meant most of August and September, which was exactly when the water mattered most. "He'll bring you the same document," she said, "with the same surface-level fairness. And if you sign it the way the others did by next summer, you'll be buying water from a man who currently doesn't own a drop of it." Callum had been very still while she talked. Not the stillness of someone not listening. The other kind. The stillness of someone who was listening with everything they had. "Can it be challenged?" he asked. "The agreements the others signed?" "Possibly. There's a territorial code about shared water rights for adjacent properties that predates Drew's agreements. If I can find the right precedent, there's an argument that his priority clause is unenforceable." She paused. It would take time, and someone who could argue it before a territorial judge. "You argued your own case before a territorial judge. I lost," she said. "You got further than most people would have with the same facts." He said it flatly, without performance, like a man stating what he saw. She looked up at him. He was already looking at the documents again. She told herself that his opinion didn't matter to her. She told herself she was here for the 40 acres and the chance to stop losing. She told herself a great many things that night, walking upstairs to her room while the lamp was still burning in the kitchen below. She was not sure she believed any of them. She woke before dawn the next morning, as she always did, habit built from years of homestead mornings when the day started before the light. She dressed, went downstairs, found the kitchen empty and the stove cold, and built the fire herself. She made coffee, found flour and salt pork, made a simple breakfast. When Callum came downstairs, he stopped in the kitchen doorway for a moment, looking at the table already set, the coffee already poured. Something moved across his face that she couldn't name. Then he sat down and ate without comment. After breakfast, she said she wanted to see the property. He showed her all of it. 3 hours on horseback through cold October air that tasted like iron and distance. He named things as they rode. The north pasture where the winter grass held longest. The spring-fed pond that had never gone dry in 15 years. The south fence line where 3 posts had been pulled out and replaced 3 times in the past 2 months. He said this last part without inflection, but his jaw was tight. He showed her the east boundary where her 40 acres began. She pulled her horse up and looked at it. Flat ground, good grass, a line of cottonwoods along a seasonal creek. Not spectacular, but solid. Workable. "You can build here," he said, not kindly, not unkindly, as a fact. "I know," she said. They looked at it together for a moment. "Why do you want land?" he asked, not suspicious, genuinely asking, the way you ask when you've wondered about something and finally decided to say it aloud. She considered the question. "Because it doesn't leave," she said. "People leave. Circumstances leave. Land stays where you put it." He was quiet for a moment. "That's one way to think about it. How do you think about it?" He looked out at the long grass moving in the wind. "Responsibility," he said. "Land doesn't ask for much. It asks you to show up, work it, respect it. That's a reasonable deal." It was the most words he had said to her at one stretch, She didn't point this out. They rode back to the house in the kind of silence that had very slightly changed its nature from the day before. 3 days later, she found the binders. She had been in the small room off the kitchen that served as an office, looking for a ledger Callum had mentioned when she found on the bottom shelf behind a stack of supply invoices 4 binders marked with dates going back 2 years. She opened the first one. Maps. Hand-drawn survey maps of the land east of the double spur with penciled notations marking boundaries, water sources, road access points. Notes in Callum's careful handwriting tracking changes in ownership dates of Drew's acquisitions, which ranchers had signed agreements, and when. Dates when the south fence posts had been pulled. A careful, patient record of what Drew was doing. Built piece by piece over months. She was still reading when she heard his boots on the kitchen floor. He stopped in the office doorway, looked at her with the binders. She waited for him to be angry, for him to tell her she had no business in his files. He looked at the binders. Then he walked to the office, pulled the second chair up beside her, and sat down. "I found the deed filing for the Hatcher parcel," he said, pointing to a notation in the margin of the second map. "Drew registered it in September, but backdated the survey to July. I don't know if that matters." "It might," she said. "If the July survey date conflicts with any other filing, it creates a question of record." She looked at him. "You've been building a case." "Trying to." "You don't have to try alone." He looked at her. She looked at the maps. "Show me the rest," she said. They worked through the afternoon. She asked questions. He answered them. Occasionally, she asked him to explain the geography of a specific parcel, and he sketched it from memory, quickly and accurately. She began to understand the full picture of what Drew was building. Not just land acquisition, but a strategic chokehold on water and road access for every independent rancher in the North Laramie Valley. "This is bigger than your ranch," she said. "Yes. Why are you the one fighting it?" He was quiet for a moment. "Somebody has to." She thought about that on her way to bed that night, about the man who had come to her as a practical arrangement, a signature on a document, and turned out to be keeping careful handwritten records of a man trying to steal an entire valley's water, about the way he had sat down beside her without being asked and said, "Show me," without hesitation. The dried flowers on her windowsill had lost most of their color, but still held their shape. She touched one petal with one finger. She was going to be very, very careful. 2 weeks in the roof over her room began to leak. It was minor a drip near the east wall that appeared during a night of steady rain. She put her wash basin under it and resolved to mention it to Jonesy in the morning. She didn't need to mention it. When she came downstairs the next morning, Callum was already on the roof. She could hear the footsteps overhead, the careful sounds of someone who knew where the weak points were. She looked at Jonesy. "He was up there before light," Jonesy said in the tone of a man reporting a weather observation. "I could have asked someone to fix it." "Yep." Jonesy filled her coffee cup. When Callum came in for breakfast, there was shingle dust in his hair and a scrape across the back of his left hand that he hadn't bothered to clean. She got the cloth she kept for such things and put it on the table beside his plate without saying anything. He looked at it, looked at her, used it. "Thank you," she said, because the leak would be gone by tonight. "Weather's turning," he said. "Needed doing." They ate breakfast. She thought about the word needed, the way he had said it as though fixing her roof were as obvious as fixing a fence, as though her comfort were a thing that required no deliberation, just response. She was beginning to understand that this was how Callum Reed operated. He did not speak much about what he noticed. He simply acted on it. It was, she thought, either very kind or very dangerous, depending on how much you let yourself rely on it. She intended not to rely on it. She was already relying on it. The writing lesson was her fault. She had asked in the practical way she asked most things, whether there was a horse on the property she could use regularly for getting around the ranch. Callum said yes. The gray mare in the second stall, she's steady. Nora had ridden some enough to get from place to place. But when she saddled the gray mare that afternoon and started down the south fence line, the mare had opinions about her pace and her posture that she was not shy about expressing. Callum appeared as he had a way of doing without announcement. He pulled his horse up beside her and looked at her position in the saddle. "Your weight's wrong," he said. "I'm staying on." "You're working too hard to stay on. Let me show you." He came alongside her and adjusted her seat with a few brief indications, a touch on her knee to shift her leg position, a word about where to hold her hands. Not long, not lingering, but her knee, where he'd touched it, was warm in a way that had nothing to do with the temperature. She corrected her position. The mare immediately settled. "Better," he said. She rode the fence line at the correct position and thought about the way his hands had been precise and impersonal and how that was absolutely fine and not worth thinking about at all. She thought about it for 3 more days. The Saturday that Harlan Drew came to the double spur was a cold, clear day in late October, the sky that particular shade of winter blue that looks like something polished. Nora was in the yard when the carriage came up the road, and she stood her ground and watched it come. Drew was not what she'd expected. She'd built him in her mind from the evidence of his behavior, expecting something crude. What stepped out of the carriage was a man of about 60, well-dressed, with the kind of manners that had been expensive to acquire, and the kind of smile that had learned to look genuine. He swept his hat off when he saw her. "Mrs. Reed," he said. "I hadn't heard Callum had gotten married. Congratulations." She smiled. "Thank you." Callum had come from the barn by then, and there was a moment between the two men that had no warmth in it at all under a surface that was technically civil. Drew made his offer, more money than the double spur was worth on paper. "Fair price," he said. "More than fair. Think of the freedom from the debt load, the risk, the constant work." Callum said no, with approximately 4 words. Drew's smile stayed where it was. He looked at Nora. Perhaps Mrs. Reed might see the wisdom in it, a young woman with plans of her own. Nora looked at him pleasantly. "I think the land is worth holding," she said, "particularly given the water rights situation, which I understand you've had some success restructuring in the Southern Valley." Something moved behind his eyes. "I'm not sure what you've heard, Sal." "I've read the agreements," she said. "They're interesting documents, very creative use of conditional priority language." A pause. "You're a lawyer, Mrs. Reed. I'm a widow who had to learn to read contracts," she said. "It comes to the same thing eventually." Drew looked at her for a moment longer than was comfortable. Then he put his hat back on, said something politely conclusive to Callum, and got back in his carriage. They stood on the porch and watched the carriage go down the road. Nora's shoulder was perhaps 2 inches from Callum's arm. Neither of them moved apart. "He'll come back with something else," Callum said. "Yes, but he'll think carefully about what now." She paused. "He didn't expect you to know what he was doing with the water agreements. He'll reassess." He turned to look at her. She looked back. The afternoon light was low and orange, the kind of light that makes everything look more significant than it is. "You were ready for that," he said. "I've been ready for things like that for a while now." He looked at her for a moment more. Then he nodded once and went back inside. Nora stayed on the porch for another minute, watching the road where Drew's carriage had gone. She pressed her hand flat against the porch railing and felt the cold solidity of the wood. She was doing fine. She was absolutely doing fine. It was Jonesy who told her about Claire, not intentionally and not much. He mentioned her the way you mention things you assume someone already knows, a name dropped into a sentence about the house, about why the kitchen had been rearranged years ago, about why there were 2 different styles of curtain in the downstairs windows. Nora absorbed each piece without asking for more. Claire Reed had died in the spring of 1873. The baby had come too early. Neither of them had made it through the night. Nora did the arithmetic. Callum had been running this ranch alone with Jonesy and seasonal hands for 5 years, building his careful binders of evidence against Drew, fixing other people's roofs, making coffee before the hired hands were up, carrying whatever that kind of loss does to a person when you carry it alone long enough that it just becomes part of the weight. She did not change how she treated him after learning this. She did not become softer or more careful around him. But she did notice sometimes when they were working at the kitchen table or riding the fence line or standing in the yard watching some weather come in from the north, the way his face went to a particular still place, and she understood now what that stillness was. Not hardness. Just a man being very careful about what he let himself feel. She understood that. She understood it with a precision that she might have found alarming if she'd been paying more attention to herself. It was mid-November when the supper conversation finally went somewhere real. They were alone, Jonesy having gone to the bunkhouse after an early meal. The dishes were cleared. The fire was good. Callum had the water rights maps out again, going over a new survey she'd requested from the county office, and she was annotating the margin of the county code she'd been working through. "You said land stays where you put it," Callum said, without looking up from the survey. She looked up at him. "Yes. Your husband, did he feel the same way about it?" She thought about Daniel, about his hands on the wooden handle of the first plow they'd owned, the pride in his face when the first furrow turned. "He loved it," she said. "It was his idea originally, to go west, stake a claim." She paused. "I thought it was romantic at the time. And now I know it was practical, the best practical decision either of us made." She set down her pen. "He was a good man, not complicated. I think I found that restful then. I was young enough to think uncomplicated was the same as safe." "Is there a difference?" She thought about that. Uncomplicated means you always know where you stand. Safe means you don't fall. Those aren't the same thing. She looked at the fire. "I found out what the difference was when the fever came." Callum was quiet. "What about you?" she asked, because it seemed only fair now that she had said a real thing. Another pause. She counted 3 breaths before he spoke. "Claire wanted to go back east," he said, "after the first winter. The winters here are hard." He stopped. "Then I kept saying 1 more year, get the operation stable, then we'll talk about it." He turned a page of the survey map without reading it. "We ran out of years." The fire said something in the language of burning wood, a small collapse and spark. "I'm sorry," Nora said. "It was 5 years ago. That doesn't make it smaller." He looked up at her then, just for a moment, long enough for her to see that she'd said something that landed somewhere true. They went back to their documents, but the room had changed again in that way it kept changing. Degrees at a time, warming by a measure she couldn't precisely mark, but couldn't deny either. She went to bed that night and lay awake, looking at the ceiling for a long time. She thought about what it meant to run out of years. She thought about what it meant to have them. The night the supper went silent came from no particular direction. She was reaching across the table for the salt, and his hand was there, reaching for the pepper, and their hands touched. Not dramatically. A brush of fingers, nothing more. The kind of thing that happens at tables where 2 people have been sharing meals for 6 weeks. Nothing. She felt it in her collarbone. She passed the salt. He took the pepper. Jonesy said something about the bunkhouse stove. They ate. But later, washing the dishes, she was aware of him at the table behind her with the concentration you give to things you are pretending not to be aware of. The sound of his chair, the quiet of him reading, the way the lamplight moved when he turned a page. She was in trouble. She recognized it with the clarity of a woman who had made a very specific promise to herself about not being in this particular trouble. She recognized it, and she named it, and she set it aside. For now. She set it aside for now. It came on the 1st of December, the kind of rain that didn't announce itself properly, that arrived in the early evening as something minor and escalated through the night into something that had opinions. Nora woke to the sound of it against the east window and lay still for a moment, listening to the force of it. Then she heard Jonesy's voice from the yard. Distant and urgent. She was dressed and downstairs in 4 minutes. Callum was already at the door pulling on his coat. "The South Creek," he said when he saw her. "Somebody blocked it upstream. The water's backing up against the fence." "Drew's men." "In this rain, we can't prove it." He was out the door. She went after him. The rain was cold and immediate, soaking through her coat inside of 2 minutes. They rode hard south with Jonesy behind them, the horses sure-footed in the dark in the way of animals who know their land. Nora could hear the water before she could see it, a different sound than usual, something pressured and insistent. The blockage was man-made obvious once you saw it brush and rocks piled across the narrow point where the creek passed through a low-cut diverting water against the fence line. In summer, it would have been annoying. Tonight, with this rain, it was going to take out 50 feet of fence and flood the south pasture by morning. They worked. Callum and Jonesy waded in from one side, she from the other, moving brush by armload in the dark. The rain didn't stop. The creek was cold enough to hurt past the boots, and the feet went numb fast, and she did not stop working. She found her rhythm in it, the weight of the wet brush, the resistance of the water, the cold that became a kind of clarity. Callum was working 3 feet away. She could hear him in the dark. Sometimes their hands found the same piece of brush, and they moved it together without speaking. An hour, maybe more. The blockage came apart in pieces, and the creek found its way again, the pressure easing the sound, changing back to something ordinary. She stood in the creek to her knees and breathed. They got back to the bank. Jonesy went ahead to check the fence line. Callum and Nora stood under the overhang of the small hay barn. The rain still coming, but lighter now, the worst of it over. She was soaked through. Her hair had come down completely and was plastered to her neck and face. She was too tired to care about any of that. Callum was looking at her, not assessing, not calculating. Something else, something that didn't have the quality of evaluation in it at all. "You didn't have to come out," he said. "This is my ranch too," she said. "For 11 more months." He was quiet for a moment. "You're not what I expected," he said. She looked at him. The rain had flattened his hair, and the lantern Jonesy had left on the fence post threw orange light across his face. He looked tired and wet and entirely himself, no performance in him, no careful management. Just a man standing in the aftermath of a cold night's work saying something true. "What did you expect?" she said. He thought about it. He actually thought about it, which was itself unexpected. "Someone who needed saving," he said. "I never needed saving," she said. "I needed the law to work." He looked at her for a moment. "I know that now." The rain came down. The lantern light moved. She was standing close enough to him that she could see the water on his jaw, could see the exact moment when his expression shifted into something that was not just attention, but something more specific, something with a question in it. She didn't step back. He didn't move forward. They stayed like that for a long moment, in the particular suspension of something that hasn't been said yet, but is already true. Then Jonesy called from the fence line that the posts had held, and the moment broke, and Callum called back and went to check, and Nora rode back to the house alone. She put the wet horse in the barn, dried her as well as she could in the dark, walked to the house in the thinning rain. Her hands were still shaking when she got inside. She stood at the kitchen stove and held them toward the residual heat and told herself it was the cold. She had always been practical. Practicality, she was learning, had its limits. November turned to December. December settled over the ranch in layers: first frost, then harder frost, then the first real snow that came on a Wednesday and stayed. In the cold, the days acquired a different texture. Chores took longer. The time between chores inside by the fire with the ledgers and the water rights documents and the county code took on a quality of waiting, though she would have struggled to say what for. She learned the ranch not from being told, but from paying attention. Which horses had preferences, where the fence lines were most vulnerable. How Jonesy could tell the weather was turning by the behavior of the horses before there was any visible sign. How Callum managed his hands with a minimum of words and a maximum of fairness. And how the men responded to this with the particular loyalty of people who trust without needing to be talked into it. She learned Callum's small patterns. Coffee before anything else taken black. The way he read half-present one ear always on the sounds of the property. The way he paused before answering a question that mattered to him not because he didn't know the answer, but because he was choosing the exact right words. The way he never asked for help with anything but never refused it when it was offered. She was learning him the way she had learned to read land documents, carefully, looking for the places where the language said more than the surface. What she was finding there was something she had not been prepared for. One evening in the second week of December, Callum came in from checking the north fence and said there was something wrong with the gray mare's left front. Nora went out with him. The mare was favoring the leg, but there was no visible injury. Nora had the medical book. She'd read the chapter on horses 3 times for exactly this kind of emergency. She talked through what she was seeing. Callum crouched beside her in the lantern light, and they examined the hoof together and found the small stone that had worked its way into a sensitive spot. It took 10 minutes to sort out. Then they sat back on their heels in the straw, the mare nose down in her feed bucket, Jonesy having absented himself with the timing of a man who was tired of not being elsewhere. "How do you know all of this?" Callum asked, not skeptically, with genuine curiosity. "I had to," she said. "The nearest doctor was 4 hours' ride from the homestead. If something went wrong, I needed to know what to do." She paused. "The book was $2 at an auction. Best $2 I ever spent." "You keep saying things like that." "Like what?" "Like I had to, I needed to, as if everything you know is a response to a problem." She thought about that. "Isn't it? Some things people learn because they want to, not because they have to." She looked at him. He was still crouching, arms resting on his knees, relaxed in the particular way of people who are comfortable with physical labor and physical stillness both. The lantern made warm light of everything. "What do you know because you wanted to?" she asked. He thought about it. "Stars," he said. "Their names. Which ones navigate by which. I read a book about it when I was 12, and I've been watching them since." He paused. "Not useful." "That's not true," she said. "You can navigate by them. I already know this land. I don't need to navigate." "You know them because you love them," she said. He looked at her. She felt the word land in the space between them, not a dramatic word, a small, true one. "I suppose I do," he said. The mare shifted in her stall. The straw rustled. Outside the barn, the wind had an edge to it now. December meaning business. "I should go in," she said. She went in. She stood in her room for a long time with her coat still on, looking at the window and the dark outside it. She was in very significant trouble. The 15th of December brought Owen Reed. She knew who he was before Callum introduced them, because she could see the resemblance, and because Callum's jaw had done a specific thing when the unfamiliar horse appeared on the road. Owen Reed was 5 years younger than his brother, and had developed in the interim into the kind of man who used charm the way some men use a lasso, with practiced accuracy and an eye on what he wanted to catch. He shook Nora's hand with warmth she didn't trust and complimented the house and asked about the ranch operations with the interest of a man who thought he might own it eventually. Callum was civil. His version of civil was indistinguishable from his version of being barely tolerant, but he maintained it through dinner. Afterward, while Callum and Jonesy went to check the south fence, Owen found Nora in the kitchen. He was friendly. That was the thing about him. He had the kind of friendliness that made you want to be friendly back. And she had to pay deliberate attention to what was underneath it. "He seems different," Owen said, meaning Callum meaning it as a question. Different how? Less alone. He said it with something that might have been genuine observation. "He's been running this ranch by himself for 5 years. I've been worried about him." "You don't need to be worried," Nora said. "Don't I?" He smiled. "You know, Callum has always taken on more than he should. Responsibility for everyone, for this whole valley, the way he's been fighting Drew." He shook his head. "Sometimes I think he does it because it's easier than thinking about himself." "I think that's his business," she said. "And yours now." He looked at her with something level and assessing under the friendliness. "For 11 months." She met his eyes. "For 11 months," she agreed. He left the next morning. She watched his horse go down the road, and then she stood in the kitchen and put her hand flat on the table and thought about the particular quality of discomfort she felt, which was not quite suspicion and not quite relief, but something between them that she did not like. She filed it away. She was good at filing things away. The evening that came closest, the one that she would think about later as the last evening before everything changed, started with no ceremony at all. Owen was gone. Jonesy had a cold and had gone to bed early. The house was quiet. The fire, good, the snow outside making the dark outside the windows thick and close and private. Callum came in from his last check of the evening, and instead of going straight upstairs, he came and sat at the kitchen table where she was reading. He didn't say why. She didn't ask. She poured him a coffee. He said thank you. He sat. After a while, she set down her book. "What are you thinking about?" A pause. "Whether the south fence will hold if we get another heavy snow before I can replace the 3 compromised posts." "And what else?" He looked up at her. "You've been sitting here for 15 minutes, and you looked at the fence line documentation twice and didn't open it," she said. "The fence isn't what you're thinking about." He was quiet for a long moment. She waited. She had learned to wait for him, the way you wait for a thing you want not to startle. "Claire wanted curtains," he said, "in the front room, blue ones. She had a fabric she'd ordered from the catalog, and then the winter came and everything else came, and she never put them up." He paused. "The fabric is still in the cedar chest upstairs. I haven't been able to throw it out." She thought about the cedar chest on the landing that she'd seen but never opened. "You don't have to throw it out. It's been 5 years. There's no rule about how long you keep things." "Oh." He looked at the table. "I couldn't have managed it," he said, "going back east, even if I'd agreed to go. This land." He stopped, started again. "I know that's not an excuse." "It's not an excuse," she said. "It's a fact about who you are. The question is whether you've spent 5 years punishing yourself for it." The fire shifted. He looked at her with something she had not seen from him before. Not the careful assessment, not the controlled stillness. Something less managed. "Possibly," he said. "That seems unproductive," she said, and she meant it simply practically, but something in his face moved in a way that made her think she had, without quite meaning, to said something that mattered to him. They sat together until the fire burned low. Neither of them moved to end the evening. Neither of them said anything else that was significant. But when she finally went upstairs, she stood at her window and looked out at the dark for a long time, and she thought about the word possibly, and what it meant, and what it might mean. She told herself she was not going to fall in love with Callum Reed. She was aware, even as she said it, that she was telling this to someone who had already stopped listening. Owen came back on the 20th of December. He came while Callum was out on the North Range and Jonesy was in the bunkhouse. He knocked at the door, polite as you please, and when she opened it, his face was doing something different from the first visit. Not warm, not pretending. "I have something you should see," he said. She should have sent him away. She knew this later. But she was a woman who had survived by finding out things, by knowing more than she was supposed to, and that instinct was older and more automatic than her caution. He came inside. He sat down at the table. He produced a letter. "This is a letter Callum sent to Aldridge," Owen said, "dated 3 weeks before you walked into that office." Well, she took it. It was Callum's handwriting, that careful, deliberate script she would have recognized anywhere now. The letter was direct. He had heard through the county land office about a widow named Voss, who had been fighting a land claim for 8 months and had demonstrated an unusual grasp of territorial property law. He was writing to inquire whether Aldridge might make an introduction. He had a situation that required someone with exactly that background. He had found her. He had chosen her. Not Aldridge, not coincidence. She set the letter on the table. Owen was watching her face. "He needed someone with your legal knowledge," Owen said, and he almost made it sound sympathetic. "He'd been fighting Drew for 2 years with no ammunition. You were the ammunition. He went looking for you." She looked at the letter, at the words in that careful handwriting. Unusual grasp of territorial property law. She had thought of herself as someone who had been offered a fair exchange. A transaction, yes, but an honest one. She had thought both parties with needs, both parties served. She had not thought chosen. Targeted, selected for utility. She was being useful again, as she had always been, as she would always be to the people who needed something from her and nothing else. The familiar cold thing moved through her chest, and she recognized it instantly. It was older than Daniel. It was older than the homestead. It lived in her like something she had been born knowing. You are useful. That is what you are. She stood up. "Thank you," she said, because she had been raised to be polite, and the habit was automatic. She went upstairs. She moved her things out of the front room. Not her room, she had always had her own room, but the small things she had placed around the house over 2 months. Her annotated county code from the shelf in the office. Her grandmother's second Bible from the kitchen windowsill. The notes she had kept on Drew's land patterns from the desk where she and Callum had worked together. She was putting them in her canvas bag when she heard him downstairs. She heard Owen's voice, brief, then quiet, then Callum's boots on the stairs. He knocked. She opened the door. He looked at her and at the bag on the bed and at her face, and he understood immediately. She could see that he understood. "Nora," he said. "I'm not leaving," she said. "I'll honor the contract, 12 months from signing." "Let me explain. I know what you'll explain. You needed someone with my background. You found me deliberately. Everything else is context. Yud. It's not that simple. It's exactly that simple." Her voice was level. She had spent years making it level. "You chose me because I was useful. That is a transaction. That is fine. That is what this is." "It isn't only that," he said. He said it quietly, without the careful management she was used to from him, and that almost made it worse. "Right now, I need you to leave my room," she said. He stood in the doorway for a moment. She could see him working through everything he might say the way you saw him work through things sometimes carefully and thoroughly. She waited for him to choose his words. He chose wrong. He said, "I was going to tell you." "Yes," she said. "After." He didn't answer that, because there was no answer that helped. She closed the door. She stood on the other side of it and pressed her back against the wood and listened. She counted. 11 minutes. She counted because counting was something to do with the part of her mind that wanted very badly to open the door again. He didn't knock. At 11 minutes, she heard his footsteps go back down the hall. She sat on the edge of the bed and looked at her canvas bag and did not cry. Because she had decided years ago that she was done crying over things that couldn't be changed, and she was very good at the decisions she made about herself. She was aware, sitting in a room in a ranch 40 miles from Laramie in December, with nowhere to go, with one copy of a signed contract in her bag, and nothing else that was hers except 40 acres of frozen ground she couldn't access until spring. She was practical. She was going to be very, very practical. She unpacked the bag and put things back where they belonged. And she told herself that was all it was, 3 days. 3 days of meals at the same table with conversation about the ranch. 3 days of passing each other in the hallway with adequate distance. 3 days of the cold being outside and inside both, and Jonesy going very quiet in the way of old men who had seen things before and knew when to step back. On the second day, Nora received a note from Judge Aldridge. She opened it at the kitchen table with Callum not in the room and read it twice. The 40 acres in the eastern boundary of the Double Spur Ranch had been transferred to her name. Clear deed, no encumbrance, effective immediately. No conditions. No waiting until the contract term ended. She sat with the paper for a long time. She folded it and put it in her coat pocket. On the third day, she went to sort through the winter supplies in the storage room off the back of the house. Because the work needed doing, and because work was what she did when she didn't know what to do. On the second shelf behind a stack of preserving jars, she found a small book bound in brown leather. No title on the spine. She opened the cover. The handwriting was not Callum's, smaller, more slanted. Claire, she knew, before she read the first line. She should have put it back. She sat down on the storage room floor and read. Not all of it. She was not that kind of person to read through another woman's private thoughts from end to end. But the pages she read, the pages she could not quite put down. Claire Reed had been 26 when she died. She had been funny and impatient and had missed her sisters in Illinois with a specific physical ache she described exactly. She had loved Wyoming in the summer and resented it in the winter. She had wanted to go back east with equal parts genuine longing and guilt about that longing. And she had written about Callum. She had written he loves the way mountains love, which is entirely and without words and with great patience, and it is sometimes the loneliest thing in the world to be loved that way. And she had written, I think he believes that if he wants something badly enough, it will go wrong, and so he keeps wanting carefully. At a distance, as if desire were a thing that could be managed. Nora sat on the storage room floor for a long time. Then she put the book back exactly where she had found it. She walked through the house and out the back door and across the yard to the barn because she had heard him in there earlier, and he was likely still there. He was. Repairing tack the work of winter things you fixed when the land gave you a moment. He looked up when she came in. She set the deed to her 40 acres on the workbench beside him without speaking. He looked at it. He had the expression of a man who had expected to be called to account and had been waiting and was glad that waiting was almost over. You went to Aldridge, she said. Yes. Before the contract term ended. So, yes. Why? He set down the tack. Because I wanted you to know it was real, he said. The land, not tied to the contract, not conditional. He paused. Not something I could take back. You can't buy trust with a deed. I know that. Then why? He looked at her with the expression she'd glimpsed that night in the barn doorway after the rain, the one with the question in it. Because it was the truest thing I knew how to do, he said, and I needed to do it regardless of what happened after. She stood in the barn with the cold coming under the door and the horses quiet in their stalls and the smell of hay and leather and winter. She thought about Claire's words, about wanting carefully, at a distance. Why did you choose me? she asked, not the legal background. Why me specifically? He was quiet, the truest kind of quiet. Because Aldridge told me you'd been fighting for 8 months, he said, by yourself, without anyone to fight alongside you. And he said you understood the land the way people understand it when it means something to them, not as investment, as home. He stopped. I thought that was someone I could respect. He looked at the workbench. I didn't plan for anything past respecting you. And she was quiet for a long time. You should have told me, she said. Yes. That was a decision you made for me, about what I should know and when. Yes, it was wrong. She heard the plainness of it. No qualification, no self-defense. Just yes and yes and yes. I found Claire's journal, she said. He went still. I only read a few pages. I wasn't trying to read it. She paused. She wrote about you. He said nothing. She was right, Nora said, about how you love, like something that needs to be managed. She looked at him. I know what it is to protect yourself that way. I've been doing it for 3 years. She took a breath. It is very lonely. The barn was warm with the heat of the horses and the gathered cold outside. The lamp threw its orange light. I know that, he said. His voice was different, not managed. I haven't forgiven you yet, she said. For the choosing, for deciding I didn't need to know. I understand. But I'm listening, she said. If you have something else that's true to say. He looked at her. He was not a man who spoke easily about the things that mattered most to him. She knew it the way you know the specific weight of a thing you've been carrying. I don't want you to leave at the end of the year, he said. I want you to choose to stay. That's the truest thing I have. The barn breathed around them. I'm not forgiving you tonight, she said. I know. But I heard you. She walked back to the house. She sat in the kitchen with her hands around a cup of coffee and thought about the word choose, about the difference between being chosen and choosing, about the years she had survived without choosing anything, only responding, only managing. She thought about what it would mean to choose. She had never been very good at wanting things for herself. It had always seemed like the quickest way to get hurt. She was beginning to think that not wanting things was just a slower way to the same place. Christmas came and went with a quietness that was not unhappy. January brought more snow and the particular close world of a ranch in deep winter. Work warmth, the small necessities of keeping living things alive when the temperature dropped to the kind of numbers that meant business. She did not forgive him all at once. That was not how she worked, and he seemed to understand this. He did not press. He showed up to the work of every day with the same steadiness she had come to rely on, and she noticed now that steadiness for what it was. Not coldness, not the absence of feeling. The presence of someone who understood that some things required patience, and who had the particular quality of caring that expressed itself through showing up. One evening in January, she came in from the barn and found that he had left dinner on the stove with a note that said, "Gone to check the north fence back by 8. Feed without me." The note was in his careful handwriting. She ate. She waited. He came back at 7:30, cold from the wind, and she had kept the coffee hot without quite being conscious of having decided to do that. She poured him a cup. He said thank you. She said, "The north fence is holding." He said, "For now." They sat at the table, and she was aware of the distance between them, which was not much, and of the warmth of the room, which was considerable, and of the particular quality of the evening, which was something she recognized now as home. She thought, "I am choosing this." She did not say it aloud, but she let herself think it, without qualification, without the defensive second thought. I am choosing this. February arrived with a brief thaw that gave false hope, and then a hard freeze that made everything worse the way Wyoming weather did things. She was outside working the ice off the water trough when he came up beside her and without a word took the other handle of the pick. They worked side by side for 20 minutes, neither speaking their breath, making clouds in the frozen air. When the trough was clear, he didn't leave immediately. He stood beside her, looking out at the ranch, the white fields and the silver fence lines, and the mountains beyond. Harlan Drew withdrew his petition on the South water rights, he said. She looked up. The county clerk sent word this morning. He's not going to fight the old territorial precedent you found. He paused. I think he'll try something else eventually, but not this year. She looked at the land, white and still and entirely itself. Good, she said. It was your work, he said. You found the precedent. You wrote the argument. It was your careful records that made the argument possible. He looked at her. Something in his face was different from the beginning, from the man who had stood at the window with his back to her in Aldridge's office. Still careful, but not kept. Nora, he said. Yes. I'd like to show you something. He led her east, past the winter pasture, past the cottonwood line, past the boundary of his formal ranch land, to the first rise of her 40 acres. The snow had a crust on it that crunched underfoot. The sky was the thin, bright blue of February, cold and clear and without mercy. On the flat land of the eastern parcel at the corner, she'd noticed that day in the fall when they'd first ridden out. There was a foundation. She stopped. Stone foundation laid careful and true, the corners exact the stones fitted, maybe 20 by 24 feet, sitting in the snow of her land like a question. When? She said. November, when the ground was still workable. He stopped beside her. I didn't tell you because I didn't know then what I was doing exactly, only that it seemed necessary. She looked at the foundation, at the care of it, the precision of the corners. You built me a foundation, she said. I built you a start, he said. The rest is yours to decide. She walked to it, stepped over the stone threshold into the open square of it, turned around in the snow inside the footprint of a house that did not exist yet, looked at the sky from inside the outline of walls that had not been built. The land was flat and good, and hers. The mountains were on the horizon. The sky was enormous and cold and full of light. She looked at Callum standing outside the foundation with his hat in his hands and his face with nothing managed about it at all. You don't have to stay, he said. The deed is yours regardless. The foundation is yours. Build what you want here. A house if you choose. Leave it as land if you choose. Leave Wyoming entirely, if that's what you choose. He paused. I am not going to put anything in writing about what I want, but I want you to know that I want it. She stood in the outline of the house she might build. She thought about 3 years of managing alone, about Daniel, who had been good and steady and whom she had loved in the practical way she loved practical things. About the cold room above the hardware store in Laramie, the 8 months of losing by inches. About 37 clauses and a wagon ride, and the way a man's handwriting could be careful and precise and not at all what you expected. She thought about choosing. I forgive you, she said, not because it didn't matter. It mattered, but because I understand the instinct, and because what came after was real, and because I'm very tired of holding things. He was quiet. I'm not leaving in March, she said. I'm not leaving. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. His face said everything his mouth was too careful to. She stepped over the foundation threshold and walked toward him through the snow on her land. He met her halfway. Spring came slowly, as it always does in Wyoming, testing its welcome before it committed. The snow retreated in stages, the fields going from white to brown to the first uncertain green of new grass. The creek ran high with snowmelt and ran clear, unblocked the way water runs when no one is interfering with it. Harlan Drew spent the spring in Cheyenne reportedly dealing with a Territorial Land Commission inquiry that had started improbably from a precise and well-documented complaint filed in late February. Nobody in the North Laramie Valley was sure exactly who had filed it. Nora thought the county code she'd been annotating all winter might have had something to do with it. She didn't mention this. Owen Reed came by once in April. He was polite and brief and left without incident, and they both understood he would not be filing any competing claims on the double spur. The cattle survived the winter well. Jonesy said it was a good sign for the year. Jonesy said a great many things, and most of them turned out to be true. In May, Nora began building. Not alone. Callum built alongside her, and Jonesy offered advice of questionable accuracy but genuine enthusiasm, and 2 of the ranch hands contributed on their afternoons off. The house went up slowly through the spring and into summer frame by frame. Each piece added to the foundation that had been laid in the autumn when neither of them had known quite what they were building. She chose the windows herself, wide ones east-facing to let in the morning light. He did not choose curtains. He waited until she chose them. Blue as it happened, not because of Claire's unfinished fabric, because blue was what suited the room, the light, the look of the sky from that east-facing window in the morning. Some choices arrive without needing explanation. In August, when the house was livable, though not quite finished, when the water rights petition had been formally decided in the valley's favor, and Harlan Drew had quietly sold his eastern parcels and redirected his attention to another county, Nora stood on the porch of her house on her land in the long gold light of a Wyoming evening and thought about what it felt like to have arrived somewhere, not at an ending. Somewhere, a place you'd worked toward and then found yourself in and understood that this was it. This was what you'd been building toward, and that it was both exactly what you'd imagined and entirely unlike anything you'd imagined simultaneously. Callum came out and stood beside her. "Fence needs checking in the morning," he said. "It always does," she said. They stood in the evening. The land stretched out before them, her land and his land, and no clear line between them now, the way things grow together when they're tended long enough. "No regrets," he said. She thought about it honestly. She had a few. The years before. The things she hadn't known to ask for. The time she had spent not choosing. "About this," she said. "No." He put his hand over hers on the porch railing. His hand was warm and rough and careful. She turned her hand over and held it. The stars were beginning. One at a time, the way they always came, each one a name he knew, and she was learning. "Tell me one," she said. He looked up, found one, told her its name and where it sat in the seasoned sky, and how the old navigators used it. His voice in the evening was different from his voice in the office or at the table. Quieter, less careful. She listened. The land was still. The night was coming. The house behind them held its warmth. This was what she had built. Not the house, though the house was hers, and she was proud of it. Something larger than the house. Something that began when she had stepped into an office and looked at a contract and decided she was not done, yet she was not going to be done yet. There was still something left to fight for. She had fought for it. It had cost her. She had paid. And here on the other side was this: 2 people on a porch, a sky full of stars with names. A foundation that had grown into a house that was becoming a home. Some things cannot be bought or sold, can only be built, one piece at a time, one choice at a time, one true word at a time. One person deciding in the face of every good reason not to, that they will trust, that they will choose, that they are worth choosing for. That was the real contract. 37 clauses and a signature, and then the 38th, the one no one writes down. The one that says, "I am here, and I am staying." And this is real. Nora Voss had signed it in the spring. In the years that followed, the double spur grew. The house on the eastern parcel became the house where they lived, and the original ranch house became the operations base. And the land that had nearly been taken by Harlan Drew was the land their children learned to ride on. The legal case Nora had built through that long winter was cited twice in subsequent territorial proceedings and once in an early state court ruling on shared water rights, her name in the margin of history, the way it had always been in the margins of the documents that mattered. In Laramie, Judge Aldridge kept a copy of her brief in his files. He showed it to young lawyers, sometimes the ones who came through looking discouraged. He told them a widow with a $2 medical book and a county code she'd annotated herself built this argument. Think about that. And the ranch stood. The way ranches stand when someone cares for them, which is to say imperfectly with interruptions and setbacks and arguments about the south fence and years that were harder than others. But standing, rooted, continuing. Because some things, once they're built, right hold. Because some foundations were laid in faith before anyone knew what would be built on them. Because some agreements, the ones that last, were never about the 37 clauses at all. They were about the space between two people who have both decided very firmly that they are not going to feel a thing. And then felt everything.